Certainly, as we listen to that song, we know that we have reason to rejoice because God gave his life for us. Before we start, let's bow our heads for prayer. Our Father in heaven, as we think about all the blessings that you have given to us, the way that you have led in our lives, we ask that you'll touch our hearts and help us all to have that experience of rejoicing in you. We know that you have asked us to rejoice, not only in the good times, but also in the bad. And we ask that you'll give us the strength and the courage to follow through on that. In Jesus' name, amen. You know, when you get a chance to come up here and talk to people, you always think about all the many people are out here and the time that's being spent, and wonder what you can do to make that time be valuable for everyone. And as I work on this sermon, I realize so much that what I do is something that touches my heart. It is something that's important to me, and I hope that it will also reach out to you. And this rejoicing in adversity that I've been thinking about really hit home for me as I walked into the church today. Why, I was told that a very dear friend from back when we worked at Kinderhook, who was the Pathfinder leader for my children and co-leaders, we worked together for many, many years, and she passed away this week, and her memorial service will be at the church this Sabbath. And you know, the church was just so excited on Mother's Day, they dedicated the church, and everybody was all excited about moving in, and now, you know, one of their members has passed, and a friend of mine. And yet, you know, God tells us that we have to rejoice in the way he's led in people's lives, and she was a real positive influence on many people's lives, and we just have to be thankful for that influence and know that she's resting in Jesus and awaiting his coming. I'm sure you've all heard this before, but every time I hear it, it touches my heart, and so I hope it does you too. 'Twas battered and scarred, and the auctioneer thought it hardly worth his while to waste his time on the old violin, but he held it up with a smile. "What am I bid, good people?" he cried. "Who starts the bidding for me?" $1, $1. Do I hear two? $2. Who makes it three? $3 once, $3 twice. Going for three, but no. From the room far back, a gray-bearded man came forward and picked up the bow. Then, wiping the dust from the old violin and tightening up the strings, he played a melody pure and sweet as the angel sings. The music ceased, and the auctioneer, with a voice that was quiet and low, said, "What now am I bid for this old violin?" as he held it up with the bow. 1,000, 1,000. Do I hear two? 2,000. Who makes it three? 3,000 once, 3,000 twice. Going and gone, said he. The audience cheered, but some of them cried, "We just don't understand. What changed its worth?" Swift came the reply, "The touch of the master's hand." And many a man with life out of tune and battered and bruised with hardship is auctioned cheap to a thoughtless crowd, much like that old violin. A mess of pottage, a glass of wine, a game, and he travels on. He's going once, he's going twice, he's going and almost gone. But the master comes, and the foolish crowd can never quite understand the worth of a soul and the change that is wrought by the touch of the Master's hand. This poem was written by Myra Brooks Welch. She came from a family that was very, very musical, and early on she became a very accomplished organ player. But she was struck with severe arthritis that crippled up her fingers so that she could only hold them about like this. And so music was no longer an option for her. But she learned to hold pencils upside down, and with the eraser end of the pencil, she was able to push the keys of a typewriter. Now, most of you have heard of what typewriters are? Okay. Just want to be sure that everybody knows, because, you know, for you younger set, they're a word processor without any memory. Anyway, she learned to type out with the eraser end of the pencil, and she wrote this poem, and she just turned it in the offering plate at her church, and it was printed in the bulletin. And it kind of took off from there, and she did not put her name to it. And it began to be printed here and there and everywhere, and finally at one fairly large religious convention, they read that poem and said it was by author unknown. And a young gentleman stood up and he said, "I think it's time that you do know." He said, "My mother wrote that." And after it came out in public that she had written it, she went on and she wrote a large book of poetry. But this poem was the one that was the most famous that she ever wrote, and one that has touched so many lives. And, you know, I was browsing on the internet, and I found a story of a lady who had lost her left hand in an accident. And she was very, very discouraged. She was only a young girl when it happened. And her teacher read her this poem and said, "You still have a potential." And I actually found this on a website where she was teaching people with handicaps how to type on word processors now, not typewriters, but how to be able to use the word processor with only one hand or with one hand and one finger. And so, you know, not only has it touched people spiritually, but it's also touched them and helped them out with some of the challenges that they face in life. To start off with today, I'd like to have you turn with me to Acts 16. And this is a story that's probably familiar to all of us, but I think there's some lessons we can learn from it. We're going to start with verse 12. This is talking about Paul and Silas and their missionary trip. From thence to Philippi, which is the chief city of that part of Macedonia, and a colony, and we were in that city abiding certain days. And on the Sabbath we went out of the city by a riverside, where prayer was wont to be made. And we sat down and spake unto the women which resorted thither. Now, according to Jewish culture, I believe it was if there were 6 men, you could have a synagogue. But Paul is going out with women, so evidently there were not enough men in that town to have a synagogue, and so they were out resorting to worshiping along the river. But one of the things I was thinking about as I was reading about this is a little bit about worship, particularly in the Old Testament. You know, you think of the tabernacle, and, you know, there was the whole holy place and the most holy place and the courtyard, and then in front is where they did the sacrifices, where the congregation did not ever enter into the building. You know, when you came to Solomon's temple, it was the same thing. You know, worship was always done outside. And up until almost the time of Jesus, when they began to have the synagogues, was the first time that they began to do worship inside. So I think as you look at worship in the Old Testament particularly, some of those verses make a lot more sense when you realize that people are worshiping outside. And, sometimes when we're here in this room singing, it may sound a little bit anemic because we are not real big crowd and we are not all singing. But imagine if we were outside and there was nothing to redirect the sound back to us. It would really be quiet. And that's why so much in the Bible it talks about singing loud. Because when you're worshiping outside, if you don't sing loud, you don't hear it at all. And so I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing that helped me to understand some of the emphasis on worship that we see in the Old Testament. And verse 14, a certain woman named Lydia, a seller of purple of the city of Thyatira, which worshiped God, heard us, whose heart the Lord opened, that she attended unto the things which were spoken of by Paul. When she was baptized in her household, she besought us, saying, if ye have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house and abide there. And she constrained us. Now, this is interesting because in Bible times, there were not very many women that were business people and running things on their own. And there's no mention here of a husband, so it's quite likely that she was a widow or a single woman, and yet she was running this business selling purple cloth and had evidently become fairly wealthy because she was able to take Paul and Silas and the rest of their company into her home to stay. We know at least that Luke was there and Timothy, so she had at least 4, maybe more people that she was keeping in her house at that time. And verse 16, it came to pass as we went to prayer, a certain damsel possessed with a spirit of divination met us, which brought her masters much gain by soothsaying. So here is this slave girl, and she has demon possession, and her owners make their living by having her give prophecies, and people pay to hear the prophecy. She was probably a follower of the god Python, which is the snake that we all are familiar with. But Python supposedly guarded the oracles of Greece. And Apollos, one of the Greek heroes, came along and killed this python to get access to those oracles. And then Apollos became known as Apollos Python because he had killed this, and then he was worshipped as a god. So here she is, she's probably worshiping this heathen god, but as she's following them, verse 17, the same followed Paul and us and cried, saying, these men are the servants of the Most High God, which show us the way of salvation. Now, it's always nice to have publicity, right? And have someone coming around saying, these people are really doing good. But as she followed them day after day, Paul said, this lady is saying what good we're doing, but everybody knows what her character is. I don't think this is something that's helping us. And in fact, he began to feel that people were being turned away because of her continual following and crying after them. So in verse 18, and she did this many days, and Paul, being grieved, turned and said to the Spirit, I command thee in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her. And he came out that same hour. And what a change in this woman. Before she had been possessed with the devil and had gone through, and if you would read about what their ancient culture was for prophecy, they would have someone usually interpret all this mumble jumble of speech that came out, and most of the time you would only understand a word here and there, but someone else would listen to it and say, oh, she said this or this or this, and it probably means that. So here was a person, who probably could not speak intelligently, but yet in her heart she longed for something better. And as soon as Paul cast out that demon, she devoted herself to following Christ, and an immediate change was made in her life. When her masters saw that the hope of their gains were gone, they caught Paul and Silas and drew them into the marketplace under the rulers. And a lot of the people in that town, in one way or another, made their living off of the worship of false gods. And so as they realized what Paul and Silas were doing, they all felt it was very important for their livelihood that Paul and Silas be silenced. And they brought them to the magistrates, saying, these men, being Jews, do exceedingly trouble our city, and teach customs which are not lawful for us to receive, neither to observe, being in Romans. One of the problems with being a Christian back then was if you were among the Gentiles, everybody thought you were a Jew. If you were among the Jews, everybody thought you were not following what you should because you didn't necessarily observe all the requirements of the Jewish law. So everyone was kind of against Christians because they didn't fit in with either mold of society at the time. And so as they listened to them preaching, this was probably about the time that Rome began to really crack down on the Jews. And there was a rule that the Jews could worship freely in their synagogues, but they were not allowed to preach to any Gentiles and convert them. So when Paul came in there and they considered him a Jew, why, he was violating the law by just preaching to the general public. So the multitude rose up together against them, and the magistrates rent off their clothes and commanded to beat them. Now, normally, when you were beaten in Roman times, you were tied to a pole with your arms upraised, and they had a specially trained person with a long rod, and they would beat you across the back with that rod. Jewish law said you could only be beaten 39 times with that rod, because they felt that if you were beat 40 times, it would kill you. But the Romans didn't have that restriction, and Paul says that he was treated exceedingly roughly by them. So it was probably much more than 39 lashes he received at this time. And you can imagine what his back felt like. And it was Paul and Silas both. So after that beating, they were cast into prison. And if you would look here, this is the actual prison that they believe that Paul and Silas were cast into. And this opening was not there when they were there. The prison would actually be walled up solid. So once you were inside that prison and the door was shut, there was no air circulating at all, and virtually no light in there. So you would be sitting pretty well in darkness, and it'd be hot and stuffy, very uncomfortable. And then verse 23, when they had laid many stripes upon them, they cast them into prison, charging the jailer to keep them safely, who, having received such a charge, thrust them into the inner prison and made their feet fast in the stocks. Okay, so everyone familiar with stocks? You know, you have two boards with holes in them, and you put your feet through there, and then another board goes over the top, and they hold it down. Well, at this time, to be very sure that Paul and Silas didn't get away, they added one little wrinkle to that was kind of interesting. instead of your foot being level, they elevated it up probably 1.5 or 2 feet so that your feet were raised up. And then your hands were chained to the wall. So they were forced to lay on the hard stone floor on their backs. And they probably could push with their elbows and lift themselves off a little bit and then fall back down. And I tried that this morning. Put my feet up on the couch. I didn't get my back beat first, but I put my feet up on the couch and I tried to lift myself up with my elbows. And I tried it for about 30 seconds, and I said, if I'm going to stand up here and preach, I've got to quit. It is really hard on you. And at midnight, Paul and Silas prayed and sang praises unto God, and the prisoners heard them. Now, it says, and at midnight, but if you really translated that the way the original language says, it would be up until midnight. So all evening they were in there singing praises and praying with their backs bruised and bleeding, just laying in that position would be enough to give you pain and discomfort, but let alone having that beating. And, not only were they singing, but all the prisoners around were just totally amazed. Can you imagine what it would be like if you walked into jail and you just started singing? That's so different from everybody else, and they'd never heard anybody do that. So the jailer was sitting there kind of thinking to himself, I wonder what's going on with these people, when he went to bed. And then verse 26, suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken. And immediately all the doors were opened and everyone's bands were loosed. Okay. Now, think about this earthquake. It's hard enough of a quake to force all the doors open, and it's enough of a quake to free everybody's hands from their fetters and their feet from the stocks, but nobody got hurt. Okay, does that sound like your typical earthquake? I am sure that there was an angel that came from heaven and caused that earthquake and made sure that Paul and Silas were set free, and that all of the people were there and they were all free, but none of them left. In some way they were constrained, even though they were free, to avoid leaving. And the jailer, verse 27, the keeper of the prison, awaking out of his sleep and seeing the prison doors open, drew out his sword and would have killed himself, supposing that the prisoners had been fled. Now, back there, I think if you hear about when Peter was in prison and he was chained between the guards and the angel came and let him loose, the next day all those guards were killed because they had let their prisoner go. So the jailer knew that he would be killed, and according to the Roman military code of conduct, if you have done something that required your death, the honorable thing was to kill yourself first and save the government the expense. So he was really doing what was expected of him. But Paul cried with a loud voice, saying, "Do thyself no harm, for we are all here." Then he called for a light and sprang in, came trembling and fell down before Paul and Silas, and brought them out and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" Now, one of the things that I think probably happened here is the jailer had seen what had happened. He'd seen the lives of Paul and Silas, but I think he also had heard what happened to that slave girl and the big change that came in her life as well. And he thought about his life. And when Paul and Silas had come in, he had done everything he could think of to make life miserable for them. And when he was there ready to commit suicide, Paul and Silas didn't have to do anything. and he would have died. But they spoke up and told him not to do that and saved his life. So he realized that these were people that, in spite of all he had done to them, they still loved him and cared for him and obeyed God. And they said, "Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved in thy house." And they spake unto him the word of the Lord, and to all that were in his house. And he took them the same hour of the night, and washed their stripes, and was baptized, he and all his straightways. When he had brought them into the house, he set meat before them, and rejoiced, believing in God with all his house. This is one of those really quick evangelistic series. It starts at midnight, and Paul preaches to the jailer, and by sunrise, the jailer and all of his family have been baptized. Paul and Silas have had their wounds treated, and they've sat down and had something to eat. So things really moved very fast, but Paul and Silas were affected by the Spirit of God and knew that this was someone who had really had a change of heart and was really searching for what God had to offer for him. When it was day, the magistrates sent the sergeants, saying, "Let these men go." So the rulers then sent the sergeants, and the sergeants were actually probably the same people who had beaten them with the rods, and came to let them go. And the keeper of the prison told this, saying to Paul, "The magistrates have sent to you to let you go. Now therefore depart and go in peace." And the jailer was thinking, they ought to be really grateful. Here they are. They've been in prison, and now they get their release. But Paul said unto them, "They've beaten us openly, uncondemned, being Romans, have cast us into prison, and now do they thrust us out privily? Nay, verily, let them come themselves and fetch us out." So, being a Roman citizen, you were not supposed to be ever punished without having a trial. And there was no offense that a Roman could commit that would allow for a public beating like that. If a Roman was to be punished, they would at the very least have been punished in private and not out in the marketplace in front of everyone. And so those magistrates realized that having punished a Roman in public, they were very likely to lose their position and all of their goods because they had violated the commands of what were given to them. So the sergeants told these words to the magistrates, and they feared when they heard that they were Romans. And they came and besought them and brought them out, and desired them to depart out of the city. And they went out of the prison and entered into the house of Lydia. And then when they had seen the brethren, they comforted them and departed. And as I looked at this story and thought about how Paul and Silas could sing in prison, and then I began to look at the other references in the Bible that talk about rejoicing. And, there are some cases in the Bible where people rejoiced when things were going well. Do you remember the man whose crops were doing so well that he couldn't fit them all into his barn? And he rejoiced and said, "I'm going to tear down my barns and build bigger ones." And God said, "Well, wait a minute. Tonight your soul is going to be required of you." And the man died. So, sometimes it's not so good to rejoice if our heart is not right. The first time that I could find rejoicing mentioned in the Bible is in Leviticus 23:40. "And you shall take on you the first day the boughs of goodly trees, branches of palm trees, and the boughs of thick trees, and willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. So this is the Feast of Booths, and God is saying, as part of your worship, I want you to rejoice for 7 days. Okay. Verse 20, or chapter 26, verse 11. Yeah. I'm sorry, that's Deuteronomy 26, verse 11. And thou shalt rejoice in every good thing which the Lord thy God hath given unto thee, and unto thy house, and the Levite and the stranger that is among you. And then we're all familiar probably with the story of Samuel and how he was asked of God. And when Hannah brought him back to the temple to dedicate him, 1 Samuel 2:1, Hannah prayed and said, My heart rejoiceth in the Lord. Mine horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth is enlarged over mine enemies, because I rejoice in thy salvation. And again, I talked earlier about what it was like to worship outside. Nehemiah 12:42 and 43. The singers sang loud with Jezahiah, their overseer. And that day they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The wives also and the children rejoiced, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard even afar off. And so you didn't even have to be in town to hear the worship service going on. They were rejoicing and singing, and you could hear them outside of town. As you look at the Psalms of David, he talks a lot about rejoicing. Psalm 19:8, the statutes of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. So he's saying that we should rejoice as we see the commandments. Verse 33, verse 1, rejoice in the Lord, O ye righteous, for praise is comely to the upright. And when we come to the story of Jesus' birth, as the wise men saw the star, and they rejoiced as the star shone again after they had stopped in Jerusalem, and it led them on to Bethlehem. When you have the story of Jesus, that Jesus told the parable of the lost coin, and how everyone rejoiced when the coin was found, and the story of the prodigal son, how they rejoiced when the son came back. And I was thinking about a little bit about what it is that we need to rejoice for. I think most all of us here have work to support ourselves. And, as we go each day to our job and do our work, we feel like we've accomplished a lot. But when you stop and think about it, could you do anything without God's help in your life? But yet, all of us say that, but yet at the end of the day, when we finished our work, we say, hey, I really did something today. This week I was baling hay, and I put up about 100 bales of hay, and I thought, man, I really did some work this time. But yet, without God interfering there and giving me the strength and the power to do that and holding off the rain, why, I couldn't have done that. And, I think it's kind of easy for us, if we stop to think about that, to see that in our physical life. But I think in our spiritual life it's very much the same. God has offered us salvation. It's a free gift. But we can't just sit there and say, well, God offered this free gift of salvation. I don't have anything to do. We have to accept it, and we have to put forth an effort on our part to see that we build a relationship with Jesus. I found a story in closing that I think may help a little bit to have us understand rejoicing in God. And this story is a parable. I checked it out. I could not find any basis of it happening. It's been told in many variations, and I did never find any one that was really true, but I think it's a parable that helps us to understand. And this story took place, involved a man, his wife had died, and he had a young son who was college age, and both of them took a real interest in art. And this man happened to have a lot of money, so they would travel over in the summer to Europe to art auctions, and whenever they find something that really struck their fancy, well, they would buy it. So he had accumulated quite a collection of pretty famous works, Rembrandt's and all that kind of stuff. I took art appreciation in college, and so I don't appreciate any art at all because I was kind of a rebel in college. But anyway, he had this big collection of art, and son got drafted in the Vietnam War, and he went over there, and he was working as a medic, and he came into an area where there were a bunch of wounded, and he was picking them up. As he was carrying back the last soldier, he was hit by a sniper and he died instantly. And about a week before Christmas, a man showed up at the door of this older gentleman who owned the art collection, and he said, I came by to tell you that I was the man that your son was carrying the day he was killed. And he said, I'm not very good as an artist, but he said, I painted this picture of your son, and I wanted you to have it. And the man looked at it, and it was true. He wasn't really good artist, but he said there was something about the eyes of his son that really impressed him. And he said, you've caught something there that I really appreciate. He says, I love this painting. And he said, could I pay you for it? And he said, no, your son has already paid for it and what he did for me. And so after that, whenever anybody would come to visit the man, he would always take them to this painting first. And then he would take them around the house and show them all the other fantastic paintings. After a few years, the man died, and as part of his estate, there was an art auction that was held. So the auctioneer came, and he said, okay, the first picture we are going to auction off is this picture of the man's son. And all the people were there said, oh, let's get at this over with. We want the real paintings. And the man said, well, this one has to go first. Do I have a bid for $100? No bids. He said, well, I can't continue the auction until this one is sold. And finally, back in the back, there was an old man. He'd been the gardener there at the home. And he said, all I've got with me is $10, but you can have the $10. And the auctioneer said, okay, I've got a bid for $10. Anybody else? And they said, sell it. Let's get on with the auction. So said, going once, twice, sold. And the man put down his gavel and walked off the platform. And the people said, well, what about the rest of the auction? He said, well, I couldn't tell you this, but the will stated that whoever bought the son got the whole estate. So the gardener got that whole estate for $10. But we've done even better than that. We got all of heaven for nothing. And, you know, when that gardener went home and he suddenly inherited this big estate, don't you think there was rejoicing in his household? I'm sure he was very excited. And yet how often do we, who own all of heaven, you know, have everything we want there, walk around like we just lost our last friend and that we have nothing to be happy about? And so I think it's really important that as Christians, we do rejoice in the Lord and be thankful. You know, I think part of rejoicing is being thankful for what God has done for us. And if we can really stop and think about it, have one more little thing about me personally. You probably know that I'm a farmer at heart. I always said that if I could do it, I wanted to be a subsistence farmer, but I wanted to subsist like everybody else does here in America, not like the poor people over in Africa and stuff where they just barely scratch out a meal. But I have chickens. And my chickens have kind of an apartment building. There's 3 apartments. They're each about 10 by 10. They have electric lights in them. They don't have running water, but in the wintertime, I plug in a heater for them so that they're warmer. And I do have water at the house. And I stop and realize, you know, I am so rich that my chickens live better than half the people in this world. And, you know, so if you stop and look at make that comparison, you know, not only have I been blessed spiritually, but I am so blessed, you know, physically with material blessings too. And sure, I can look around and find somebody who has a bigger house, a fancier car, or whatever. But when I look at all the people who have less, I am so blessed. And, you know, that's the thing we need to do is there's always find someone who's worse off than we are. And we need to thank God for the blessings. When we realize the blessings God has given us, I think we can really rejoice in the Lord.